I'd like to begin by thanking everyone in the Newberry's public programs department. I'm not going to start naming names because I'll surely miss some people, but this place is really important as a Chicago institution and important to me personally. And I'm delighted whenever I'm asked to do something because I almost always say yes before I've done reading the email, which can sometimes backfire, but not this time. I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for being here, whether you're here in person or you're on Zoom. Scholarship or the kind of whatever it is I do, making arguments and trying to connect dots, only really matters if you have an audience. And sometimes it's, I don't think people in my profession focus enough on publicly accessible events like this. So again, I'm very happy to be here. So the plan is I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and I just realized people are blocking my view of the clock. So I'm going to need to be informed. Right back there, that red clock I can't see. 40 minutes on Mike Royko and Richard J. Daley, the 68 Democratic National Convention riots, other riots that Mike Royko wrote about, and then there'll be time for the Q&A at the end that Liv just mentioned. I need to lead with a disclaimer, however. I will be expressing some opinions tonight. These opinions are mine and mine alone. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Newberry Library of Chicago, the English Department at Northwestern University, the regular Cook County Democratic Party, whose representatives I see here in the second to last row, or Major League Baseball. This is just me. I was handed an interesting way to start today's conversation. Monday in the Sun-Times, Rich Miller, a contemporary journalist who runs the Capitol Facts news site that covers politics down in Springfield, wrote a really interesting essay in the Sun-Times about basically how wrong it is to keep comparing the present to the past. Like, the 2024 Democratic National Convention was not something that was going to be a repeat or an automatic follow-up to the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Yeah, there's eerie parallels. When Biden dropped out, I thought, uh-oh, that's LBJ, what's coming next? But history may or may not rhyme. It doesn't repeat itself. And the way that Miller ends his piece, all I'm saying here is that we need to live more in the present than in the past. Our aging president has dropped out of the race, and now our aging news media narratives need to do the same. With Miller's points that one of the things journalists ought to do is not simply repeat narratives from the past. Just because something happened back in the day doesn't mean a parallel situation today will lead to the same outcome or even a parallel outcome. But I would argue, very forcefully if I had to, that we want to pay attention to the past in order to understand the present that we're in and the future that we may or may not be headed toward. And what I like to try to do is think about past events and how they've been framed and try to reframe them. Try to come up with other ways of thinking about the events that have been largely mythologized or perhaps accurately depicted, or somewhere on that spectrum. So in thinking about the events of 1968, the urban unrest that took place during the Democratic National Convention, and trying to come up with different ways to frame it, I want to think about, and ask you to think about, the different ways in which urban spaces work and can be understood. There's lots of ways of talking about cities. I find it very useful to look at three different sort of axes along which we can understand urban space, and then how these axes relate to the political events of the past, and not just 1968, but again, I'm going to talk about some of Royko's depictions of other riots. So we can look at cities along a spectrum from public to semi-public to private spaces. Public spaces are theoretically owned by everybody and open to everybody. Streets, parks, beaches. Semi-public spaces are open to everybody, but there's rules. Like, this is a semi-public space. To be in here tonight, you had to register and get checked in, right? We don't just let anybody just wander in. Like, you don't go into a restaurant and just sit down and not order food. Then there are private spaces that you can only enter by invitation. Homes and many aspects of businesses. And this dynamic of public, semi-public, private is absolutely central to understanding what happened in 1968. Then there's another axis, which is the difference between transitional and destinational spaces. So transitional spaces and destinations. Transitional spaces are things you are not supposed to stop in. You're supposed to just pass through. Streets, for instance. And then a destination is a place where you go and stay for some legitimate reason. This is also a big deal in 1968, because where does a lot of the unrest happen? On Michigan Avenue, right, in streets. The very nature of protests and other things are about using streets in different ways. Another axis that's useful is Ray Oldenburg, the great sociologist, his distinction between first place, second place, and third place. First place being your home, where your identity is defined by family relationships. The second place being work, which is defined economically. And third places being places you go to of your own free will to create various kinds of community. This can be bars, coffee shops, barber shops, diners. I would argue protests can be understood as a kind of third place. And the range of public activity we can get on Chicago streets, where identity gets created and expressed in large spectacles, also fall along a sort of an axis. On one end, you've got parades. Parades take place in public spaces, but they sort of transform transitional spaces into destinations, right? People marching in the parade are moving, but there's all these people lining State Street or Columbus Boulevard or whatever to watch the parade. And parades are sanctioned by power, right? You've got to get the okay from the city, because the city controls our public spaces. Demonstrations are also something that takes place in public, where the transitional becomes destinational. And it, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's kind of a third place. Community gets created or expressed through demonstrations. I'm thinking here of a couple of things that have moved from being demonstrations to being parades. The St. Patrick's Day Parade. Originally, St. Patrick's Day parades were demonstrations by a despised minority of their presence in America. Now they are, we dye the river green and everybody's Irish, and Guinness sales go through the roof and life is good. The other parallel to that, frankly, is the Gay Pride Parade. Once upon a time, a protest about Stonewall, now a celebration of an inclusive LGBTQ plus community that everybody, I mean, lots of people go there who are not of that community, but they want to be part of it. They want to be celebrating it. Then there's riots. Riots are what happen when either parades or demonstrations go wrong. The politics of talking about that is always very fraught. Is it a few bad apples? Is it the intent of people to cause violence on private property usually, and that blurring of private and public happens in riots? And in, excuse me, both riots and demonstrations, there is this dynamic of identity that can be positive or negative. Is it we are expressing ourselves and invite everyone to join us, or we are against you? An us-them construction of identity. And that is something not uncommon in Chicago. Looking at 1968's Kerner report that dubbed the events in the streets outside of the convention itself as a police riot, with these frames of different kinds of space, I think can help us deepen our understanding of what happened and think about what can happen now or in the future. It's also a reminder that these events are as much about, frankly, about image and narrative and creating an idea of the city as about what, quote, really happened, unquote. And Richard J. Daley really wanted to create an image of his Chicago. One reason why Daley succeeded in getting, or one reason why he wanted the 68 convention here was to try to erase the memory of Al Capone as like the primary thing people think of when they think of Chicago. So good work there, Dick. Did it. Now you say Chicago and people think of cops with batons, right? This was my father's. This image gets absolutely plastered all over the place in ways I'll get to in a second. It also parallels what happened in 1996. Richard M. Daley wanted the Democratic National Convention in 96 to erase the memories of the Democratic National Convention of 1968. And you do that apparently with lots of median planters and large, spectacular public spaces that people will pass through on their way from downtown hotels out to the United Center. So Daley's in all these logos. He's on the button. Some of these artifacts I have here up front I got from that invaluable research assistant eBay. The only thing I missed out on was one of these actual straw hats. I just forgot about the auction and didn't get it. I still regret it. But Daley was everywhere, and Royko mentions that in Boss. I'm going to be referring to this book repeatedly, of course. I suppose I should be on the page I'm looking for. Delegates all knew they were in Daley's city, and Daley, interestingly, kind of privatized the convention itself. While the media and the political parties had headquarters downtown at the big hotels, the actual convention was at the amphitheater way out in Bridgeport. So he took it and moved it to basically his neighborhood. And that made it harder for protesters to get to. It's not an easy part of the city to access. It was even less easy before the Orange Line came along. And he created sort of Potemkin villages along the way. He built fences hiding vacant lots and unkempt buildings and other things. But here's Royko. There could be no mistake about whose city the delegates were in. From the airport to their hotels, the name was everywhere. Quote, Mayor Daley welcomes you to Chicago. You have arrived in Daley country. When they picked up the phone next to their beds, this totally creeps me out, by the way. When they picked up their phone next to their hotel room beds, his face on a card pasted to the phone's cradle smiled up at them. Welcome, it said, Richard J. Daley, mayor. I wouldn't want to think of Daley next to my bed in a hotel in Chicago. Theater marquees, store windows were all plastered with his name, and everywhere were policemen in blue helmeted riot gear. So Daley was trying to set things up in advance, but once things went off the rails, and no way I have time to get into all of the nitty-gritty details, but when things went bad, he knew he had to change the narrative. And so after the events of the convention, within a week, the image on the right, Crisis in Chicago 1968, was on newsstands. Even earlier, it was published in Chicago's daily newspapers as like a bonus insert. And it is the city's official version of what happened. I can't read it all, but this is the final paragraphs. It includes all sorts of wacky stuff, like one of the headlines on one section is, Yippies march on the Sabbath. I was wondering, is that the Jewish Sabbath or the Christian? Anyway, but it concludes with basically quotes from Daley, one of his press sequences, or press events. Quote, in the heat of emotion and riot, some policemen may have overreacted. But to judge the entire force by the alleged action of a few would be just as unfair as to judge our entire younger generation by the actions of this mob. I would like to say here and now that this administration and the people of Chicago have condemned brutality at any time, but they will never permit a lawless, violent group of terrorists to menace the lives of millions of people, destroy the purpose of this national political convention, and to take over the streets of Chicago. And that's his conclusion, like the streets of Chicago are what he will not permit them to take over. Keep that word permit in the back of your head, because it's really important. Basically, Daley made up the idea that there were assassinations planned, and that's why he had to have all this force. And he sold it by just like sitting in front of Walter Cronkite and asserting the things that weren't true. And Cronkite just sort of was unable to fact check him in real time. And again, I'm having this weird present day deja vu going on. So that's Daley's Crisis in Chicago. On the left, Law, as you look at it, Law and Disorder, this is a publication that was put out to benefit the Illinois American Civil Liberties Union by a bunch of organizers of various outfits in the protests. And you see the name of writers who have contributed. Frankly, I don't expect Hugh Hefner to be the best prose stylist, but Arthur Miller and Nelson Algren. Algren's piece is terrible, by the way. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. He just sort of went off on a bad satire of Carl Sandburg's poem, Chicago. But some of the images in this publication, I think, are well worth examining. This is a famous photograph by Art Shea, and it kind of captures the feeling that the presence of the National Guard with bayonets mounted on their rifles had in Chicago. And not to be too disrespectful, but looking around the room, I suspect some people might have remembered this stuff personally. I'm seeing people nodding at these images like, yeah, I remember this. I was not old enough to remember it, except for my mom being really dead when my dad came home from work in one piece. So this particular image at the Conrad Hilton. Then this great political cartoon by Bill Malden, the Pulitzer Prize winner from the Chicago Sun-Times, showing up the kind of hypocrisy of, during the Cold War, Americans complaining about what the Soviets were up to in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, here we are in Chicago, an armed camp, and public not admitted, authorized personnel only. And then a final cartoon by Pat Oliphant, again, a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist. Sorry, if you ain't got no credentials to get out, you'll have to stay in Chicago forever. And note the prominence of the nightsticks, but also one of the little artifacts I have on the table down here. This convention was one of the first to use magnetic passes for people to get in and out. And you had to swipe your pass when you came into work or cover it as a journalist or when you left. And if you didn't have it to get out, you literally weren't supposed to be able to leave. Like the gate wouldn't open for you. So this might seem a little extreme, but it's actually not too far off. All right, I'm gonna go back to just a more generic image because this is what I'm mostly talking about. So this battle of images, and it does come back to your identity. Are you a loyal Democratic machine precinct captain, or are you a college student at DePaul who might be a little more liberal and not want to get drafted and sent to Vietnam, right? All these things come into play. But what I love most about Royko, going back through his work, both for the exhibition we've touted a couple of times and for this project today, is how many times he writes stuff that is so prescient and just ahead of the curve and insightful about Chicago history in ways that get beyond the sort of automatic pilot stuff. So in one column that I don't have a date for because his first collection up against it did not include the dates of the original publication, but it's in that collection and it's from sometime before 1967. And the title is, "It Seems Like Only Yesterday." And I will not read the whole column because time is short, but I'm gonna skip through it to make his point. The demonstrators began gathering early in the morning, a couple of miles from the courthouse at LaSalle and Randolph. They decided to march there to protest the arrest a few days earlier of some of 200 of their people. Few realized it would turn into a bloodbath. As they approached the courthouse, people on the sidewalks were startled at seeing so many demonstrators pouring out of their segregated neighborhood. As they marched along, there were stirring songs common to the rights movements. There had been no advance warning of a demonstration of this size, the police weren't ready for them, and the marchers easily took over the intersection at LaSalle and Randolph. And then, skipping ahead a little bit, the police come in and shoving. People begin shouting about discrimination. Some talked of job discrimination. They had lost their jobs because of what they were, or they couldn't get jobs. Others talked of economic reprisals and bad laws. They were second-class citizens and they didn't like it. Hotheads were in the crowds too. To them, civil disobedience meant violence and they were in favor of it. Nonviolent voices were shouted down. They go on, the mayor orders the bridge opened. Might sound familiar. The Clark Street Bridge. He called up more cops, and then when the bridge was put back in place, fighting broke out immediately. Both sides were swinging fists and clubs. People fell, head splits, and bones broken. Then someone fired a shot. A policeman was wounded in the arm by a shotgun blast. The gunman was killed on the spot. Others fell wounded. The demonstrators turned rioters retreated, dragging their wounded across the bridge and down Clark Street. The riot was over. It happened in Chicago, but not recently, in case you are wondering if you missed something in the papers or television over the weekend. The date was April 21, 1855, and the minority groups that rioted were Chicago's Germans and Irish. This is known today as the Lager Beer Riots. And he says, I tell this story Okay, talking about it was about beer sales being forbidden and the Irish not being allowed to become police officers. As everyone knows, people of German descent may now drink beer in Chicago, and several Irishmen have been known to get jobs on the police force. I tell this story for the benefit of those who keep wondering what this world is coming to when minority groups start marching in the street to protest discrimination. So here's Royko reaching back into what for most Chicagoans is unknown ancient city history and showing that the pattern or the structure of this kind of protest is still with us and has been with us for a very long time. So that column is one of his best, and again, I recommend it highly. He had another column from 1966, T-shirted Punk Slay a Dragon. This is in his collection, One More Time, and it depicts one of the civil rights marches for open housing that Dr. King organized, and that was met with white rioters. Fascinating aspect of this is that the cops with their billy clubs are the heroes. They're knocking the heads of the white kids who are spitting on the civil rights protesters and throwing rocks and so on. But there's also a moment in the column that I think is simply a moment of brilliance about urban spaces. After the march turns down a street of bungalows, an old man made the most intelligent comment of the day when he stood on his porch and barked, "Hey, you kid, get off my grass." A punk, he calls all the protesters punks. A punk turned and motioned to the other side of the street, said, "What you yelling at me for? Why don't you yell at the," racist epithet included. The old man snapped, "Because they ain't on my grass, you are." So the division between the public space of the street and the private space of his lawn is symbolically very important. Although lawns are really interesting. Lawns are really public spaces in that if you don't mow yours regularly, you're going to get in trouble from your neighbors. Makes me question the whole idea of the private stuff being sort of absolute. So while the cops might have been the good guys then, they were not the good guys in '68. The irony for me is that so much of what happened in '68 was about Richard J. Daley and his ideas about controlling public space, cities controlling things. The ideal of public space is that it's open to everyone. The reality of public space is it's run by the city. And that can be good or bad or indifferent. And the way Royko talks about the riots, first of all, he builds up to the fact that, what happens during the convention by pointing out that the same thing happened at another peace march in April. Completely peaceful protesters, the city jerked them around on getting permits. They finally had the permits. They end up in what's now Daley Plaza, the Civic Center Plaza. And then the cops ring them in and tell them they have to leave, but as soon as they step off the sidewalk, they start beating them because they're leaving their designated area. The tactic is now called kettling, where you sort of cut off where people can go and then you try to make them go in that direction. And it got very little press coverage because it was on a Saturday. Not all the papers covered it. And so people didn't really kind of know what was going on. But the police department knew. The police department knew that they could take their gloves off because they'd gotten away with it. And almost everybody that they were attacking in that particular mini police riot or rehearsal for later were middle-class white people protesting the Vietnam War. It wasn't yippies or hippies or outside agitators. So the key moment is that despite the fact that the amphitheater was 8 miles away, Daley would not give a permit for the protesters to spend the night in Lincoln Park overnight. The police, and I'm reading again from Boss, that Sunday night the convention, as far as most of the world was concerned, began. The issue was as simple as a child's game of King of the Hill. The protesters were in the park. The city ordinance required that the park had to be vacated by 11 o'clock. This is what may have determined the election and altered the course of world history. The decision of the city that nobody would be in Lincoln Park after 11 o'clock. The police and the city's lawyers who directed them had the law on their side, but as a practical matter, the decision to clear the park at night was bereft of logic. From the city's point of view, the protesters could not have picked a better place to camp than in Lincoln Park. He also points out elsewhere that the Boy Scouts always got a permit to camp overnight in the parks, and that regular old Chicagoans on hot summer nights would go sleep in the parks, in their neighborhoods or along the lakefront. To the north was Moore Park and the Lincoln Park Zoo. To the east was Lakeshore Drive and the beaches. To the south was Park and a huge high-rise development, and from Stockton Drive, the other border, the protesters were not even visible in the darkness. If the city had been able to choose a place to put the protesters, to isolate them from the rest of the city and the convention, to watch them, they couldn't have picked a better site than that chosen by the protesters themselves. But then they went in and started clearing them out. And this is what created several nights in a row of conflict, culminating Wednesday with the Battle of Balbo on Michigan Avenue. And that leads to a particularly famous quote, and I apologize in advance for anyone with delicate sensibilities. It's going to get a little blue in a moment here. Inside the convention center, Daley had packed the house with his loyalists. They were waving signs that said, "We love Mayor Daley." I would have brought mine down, but it's framed, and it's too big to carry on the L. And you know, at the meantime, the TV is showing the riots in the streets, and the other people in the Democratic Party who aren't from around here are noticing and thinking it's a really bad thing. So one of the most raucous exchanges of the convention, this is back from Boss, Senator Abraham Ribicoff, Democrat of Connecticut, stepped to the rostrum to nominate Senator McGovern for president, and he said, quote, "If we had McGovern, we wouldn't have the Gestapo in the streets of Chicago." Notice again, streets, right? This is all about the streets. Members of the Illinois delegation jumped up and began gesturing for McGovern to get off the platform, making thumbs down motions. Ribicoff went on, saying, "How hard is it to accept the truth? How hard it is." And the thing that got there's a sort of an excuse made for what Daley then does. Daley was on his feet, his arms waving, his mouth working. The words were lost in the uproar, but it was later asserted by Mayday, an almost underground Washington paper, that a lip reader had determined that he said, quote, "Fuck you, you Jew son of a bitch, you lousy motherfucker, go home." Absolutely not, said Alderman Keene, who claimed to have heard everything Daley said. He said, "Just go home." George Dunn, the soft-spoken president of Cook County Board, said firmly that no obscenities had been shouted, but he offered an explanation for why people thought they had been. Daley and a lot of us were shouting, "Faker, faker." That's because his presentation to our delegation, we thought he was there. I didn't hear what Daley said Senator Seymour Simon, a member of the Illinois delegation and a Jew. But others were yelling things like, "Go home, you dirty kike, you dirty agitator, communist." So, this is one of those moments where you got to say George Dunn really took one for the team. Faker, really? Mother faker of some kind? Reading this over the years and then rereading it again for today, I'd always just been struck by the crude anti-Semitism, which makes no sense because Jewish voters were a key part of the Democratic Party. Pat Nash's Lawndale wards would bring in 99% votes for whatever the Daley machine, and before that the Nash machine, candidates were before white flight and the neighborhood changed. So being anti-Jewish doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what really struck me, and of course the profanity, not great. What really struck me this time is the line, "Go home." Right? I could see other obscenities that might work there, but "go home." That's interesting. And that is, I think, the key to understanding Richard J. Daley's attitudes. He's all about hierarchies and about insiders and outsiders. And while Senator Ribicoff was certainly a Democratic insider, he wasn't from Chicago. So that made anything he said suspect. And Daley loved using the idea or using the terminology of outside agitators or outside influencers to blame everything that happened in Chicago on people who weren't from Chicago. Some of the statistics in the magazine he put out, like cited how many people were arrested were not from Chicago. They also list all of the injuries to each police officer, including such things as bruised pinky. Yeah, just nuts. I looked for my dad's name in there, but he's not in there, so I guess he was all right. But the outside influences, once again, there's a prescient column from Royko writing about the 1966 Humboldt Park Division Street riots, where after confrontations with police, Puerto Rican Americans stood up and we had 3 days of unrest in the streets, and Daley said it was all outside influencers, as opposed to any of the Puerto Ricans from the neighborhood. and Royko. There probably were outside influences who should share the responsibility for the rioting. One of the outside influences was Mayor Richard J. Daley. If he had any other ideas why there was a riot except outside influences, he's out of touch with a sizable chunk of the city. That isn't surprising. He probably spends more time at White Sox Park than he does in most of the city's less attractive areas. Although this year I'd say White Sox Park might be the city's least attractive area. He manages to attend wakes in his part of town, but when the Puerto Ricans invited him to a banquet last week, their biggest social event of the year, except for the riot, he couldn't make it. They had a huge festival in Humboldt Park that lasted all of a week. He didn't get over there, but I don't ever recall him missing one of the annual back of the yards affairs. Right? He then goes on to point out other, like the police chief is an outside influence. The whole city's power structure neglects and takes for granted the Puerto Rican neighborhood, including the fact that there isn't a single Puerto Rican precinct captain in any of the 3 wards that were 90% Puerto Rican. The term for this with Black Chicago was plantation wards. You would still have white power structure in place once the racial composition of the neighborhood had changed. So this whole insider-outsider dynamic and its relationship to these different kinds of urban space I've been talking about, I think is key, especially to understanding Daley's approach. And when Daley died, Royko wrote a really, I think, balanced and interesting and insightful column that basically stands as a eulogy. If ever a man reflected a city, it was Richard J. Daley in Chicago. In some ways, he was this town at its best, strong, hard driving, working feverishly, pushing, building, driven by ambitions so big they seemed Texas boastful. In other ways, he was this city at its worst, arrogant, crude, conniving, ruthless, suspicious, intolerant. Daley was a product of the neighborhoods, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, and he reflected it in many good ways. Loyalty to the family, neighbors, old buddies, the corner grocer. You do something for someone, they do something for you. If somebody is sick, you offer the family help. If someone dies, you go to the wake and try to lend comfort. The young don't lip off to the old. Everybody cuts his grass, takes care of his property, and don't play your TV too loud. That's the way he liked to live, and that's what he thought most people wanted, and he was right. But there are other sides to Chicago neighborhoods. Suspicion of outsiders, intolerance toward the unconventional, bigotry, and bullying. And that is, I think, one of the ways we should understand Richard J. Daley and his decisions. I could go on at great length about Bridgeport, the neighborhood that shaped Daley, and that therefore shaped Chicago, because Daley built the city we live in now. O'Hare, the expressways, UIC, all the high-rises along the lakefront on the north side, much of the loop, and obviously the public housing that has come and gone, all Richard J. Daley. But this insider-outsider dynamic of identity, it relates to the kind of institutions Daley came up in. All of the social institutions that shaped Richard J. Daley were hierarchical. You could join them, you could become part of them, and you could go to the top, but you started at the bottom. So think about unions. His father was a union man, steel workers, sheet metal workers. You are a worker, you join the union, you got your PIN, you pay your dues, maybe you become shop foreman, maybe you become the union rep, maybe you move up and become a guy who works for the AFL-CIO. Could happen. Or maybe you're just on the shop floor your whole career. But there's a hierarchy and you know your place in it. The Hamburg Social and Athletic Club, instrumental in shaping Daley, part of the 1919 race riots. And that's the same sort of thing. You can become a member, and then the members elect their treasurer, their president. Daley got elected to all sorts of offices in that organization. The Roman Catholic Church. And by the way, I got to say, I love Daley's parish, the Nativity of Our Lord, because it speaks to identity. The reason the parish has that name, which is kind of weird, right? Aren't they usually saints, right? I'm Catholic background here. The parish was originally founded by Irish stockyards workers, and they met in a barn. And where was Jesus born? In a barn, right? So there's sort of a, we're excluded from the other churches, we'll make our own church, but then we'll have a little sense of humor about it too, right? So in the church, you're a parishioner. Maybe you're an usher and you volunteer like Daley's wife and his mother both did for the church. But you are under the control of the priest. He has authority over you. And the priest, there's the bishop, and then there's the pope, and then there's the big guy, right? There's this hierarchy, and you know your place in it. And you can join it and move up. You can be just a kid who's an altar boy, but then you become a priest, right? There's this possibility, but you got to know your place. The Democratic Party. You're a citizen, you're a voter, and maybe then you become a precinct captain. Maybe you work your way up in politics to some elected office. You become the alderman or the ward committeeman or the mayor or the chairman of the Cook County Regular Democratic Party. All right, a hierarchy, and you know your place in it. And insiders always have the advantage in such hierarchies. So Daley's decision to not cut any slack to these outside agitators, the yippies, the hippies, the anti-war protesters, is completely consistent with telling Senator Ribicoff to go home, right? It's you got to be from here, and you've got to be in the hierarchy, and you got to know your place. And insiders are part of those hierarchies, and outsiders are a threat to them. That means accepting their rules and accepting how urban spaces operate. And so you can see Daley's decision to have the actual convention location in Bridgeport as a form of privatizing. Like, he made it for his insiders. But then his decision to deny the permit to camp overnight backfired spectacularly. If he'd just let them do that, there would have been no police riot. But he couldn't let them do that because that was them challenging his authority over the public spaces of the city and his power as the ultimate insider. Now, a lot of the mythology about the convention and its outcome, Royko wrote about in a column in '93. He gets invited to come on a radio show and he declines because he thinks the guy's a nitwit. And he lists the myths. Myth, the protests led to the end of the Vietnam War. Baloney. The war went on for Americans for 5 more years until 1973. It might have ended sooner with Humphrey's election. And Royko argues that the fact that the convention got so out of hand led people to vote for Nixon because they didn't trust the Democrats to run the country. If they couldn't run a week-long convention in their city, why trust them? Myth, it wrecked Daley's reputation. Also false. Lots of, the way he puts it, the majority of Chicagoans thought that bashing hippie heads was great sport. The machine came apart later for other reasons. The protests heightened the political consciousness of the boomers. Oh yeah? Then why were they such strong supporters of Ronald Reagan? Myth, it brought together young blacks and whites in a common cause. Nope. Few blacks took part in the protests. They figured that if young white suburbanites wanted their heads bashed, that was their own choice. The blacks had enough troubles of their own. But here I just want to wrap up, and then I'll get to Q&A in a moment. The myth of Daley's invincibility. This is one of the great examples of history getting in the way of history. World War I, the Great War, was a huge calamity in Western culture, but World War II was worse. So we forget how bad World War I was. Daley's invincibility after the '68 convention, his landslide re-elections in '71 and '75, created this myth that Daley was always invulnerable and invincible, and he wasn't. In the 1963 mayoral election, former Democrat Ben Adamowski almost beat Daley. He won 51% of the white vote. And Daley was elected by the black vote. And this is Royko summing up that moment in Chicago history that I think speaks to the whole concept of these conflicts over identity. The enormous black vote had given Daley his victory. And the black vote was so enormous because it was caused by segregation, which led to highly crowded wards, which led to lots of votes. The enormous black vote had given Daley his victory. The people who were trapped in the ghetto slums and the nightmarish public housing projects, the people who had the worst school system and were most often degraded by the police department, the people who received the fewest campaign promises and who were ignored as part of the campaign trail had given him his third term. They had done it quietly, asking for nothing in return, exactly what they got. And this kind of moment for Royko, I think, is really important. He understands how politics of identity and race work in the city and how it all orbits around different kinds of public spaces, private spaces, power over those spaces, and the identities of the people who shape them and are shaped by them. Thank you for listening, and it's time for questions. Before getting straight into questions, I want to make a small announcement on behalf of the city. Those of you how many of you like to do research on your own just for fun? Okay, I know a lot of you are lying. More hands? Okay. The city clerk's office has started digitizing the audio recordings of Chicago City Council meetings going back to 1970. And next year in 2025, they will be available on the city clerk's website. And that's just great, because you read about how Daley ran those meetings. I'd like to hear it. I'd like to hear him putting Len Dupre in his place, right? So I'm looking for questions more than comments. What is my opinion of CPD's performance during this year's convention? They seem to have done pretty well. NATO was a different story a few years back with Ram. I believe 60-some people were arrested when the protest outside the Israeli embassy turned violent. I think that the parallels people were expecting that Rich Miller was arguing against, in part, don't hold up because the protest movements we've got today don't have the same energy and the same skin in the game. And I'm not taking any sides on the Israel-Gaza-Hamas situation, but no American college student has to worry about getting drafted and getting sent anywhere. So the energy was very different back then, and the confrontationality was different. So my opinion that the cops did an okay job this time around. Do I think the journalists of today have the same drive to get the full story as yesteryear? Well, first of all, they would say never use the word yesteryear, that's archaic. I often feel there are questions left to ask, or are politicians better at evading the questions asked? 80% of all jobs in journalism have disappeared in the last 20 years. Something like 30% of all newspapers in Illinois have closed in the last 5 years. We don't have the journalistic resources we had in 1968, or 1978, or 98, or even 2008. The news industry is being taken over by venture capitalists who strip it for parts. I mean, the Tribune Printing Center is going to be a casino, and a few weeks ago there was a big storm and the papers couldn't get printed. For the first time in Chicago since the 1850s, there was no daily newspaper in Chicago printed because they were farming it out to secondary sources. So I think that there are some journalists today who are doing a very good job, but they have so much less resources because all the advertising that used to pay for that journalism is on the internet now. And so there's no money, and journalism does not happen for free. I was in Dick Gregory's march and was arrested. Dick G and I were the last ones seen by the night court. That's not a question. I can only say I hope the memory is warming to you. Today, Dick Gregory got arrested, by the way, marching in Bridgeport, outside of Daley's home, where the police came in and the counter-protesters were assaulting the protesters, so they arrested the protesters because they're the ones causing the trouble, right? So the question is, did Daley tell the cops to go bust heads, or did the cops just overreact? Well, it depends on who you're asking. Daley argued consistently that it was a natural human reaction for the police to respond to being spit on and yelled at and all the rest. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the behavior by much of the Chicago Police Department in any number of other moments of political unrest going back to the 1950s, their first resort is to crack heads. Royko has some pretty good analysis in Boss about the fact that the sort of the demographics of the police department skewed conservative, skewed lots of veterans, so anti-war protests they saw as an attack on themselves. He points out that many police only live in the city because they're required to by law. Daley enforced Chicago's residency rule. If you work for the city, you have to live in the city, and that's a great way to maintain a captive middle-class tax base, essentially. But it also leads to enclaves. Like we talk about segregation in this town as sort of enclaves, black, white, brown, but there's also blue. And it's mostly the far northwest and southwest sides, sort of copland, if you will. So I think it's a combination of both. And, you know, plenty of cops didn't crack heads, but plenty did. And the ones who did covered their name badges, their name badge numbers and their names. They knew they were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing from a reformer's point of view. But the reformer commissioner, W.O. Wilson, had left. And it was James Conslick, kind of a political hack, a Daley guy who was in charge of the police department. And of course, you can't talk about how the police acted in the Democratic National Convention in August without bringing up Daley's shoot-to-kill order during the King riots, where he tried to sort of wriggle his way out of it, but he basically said he wanted the police commissioner to issue an order that the police should shoot to kill arsonists and shoot to maim looters. And this was perceived by plenty of police officers as permission to do whatever they wanted to do. And again, it's so fraught. I say this coming from I'm the son, brother, nephew, uncle, cousin, and friend of countless cops. I mean, it's a family job and a neighborhood job in Rogers Park as well. And I think of cops are like bars. There's nothing better than a good one and few things worse than a bad one. Right? If you're a neighbor of a good bar, you're happy it's there. If you're a neighbor of a bad bar, you wish it wasn't. Same thing with the police. But the thing is that images like this become the sort of defining thing, and that leads a lot of people in the police, what Elwood Blues defined as Illinois' law enforcement community, to perceive themselves as discriminated against minority, as some people who have to defend themselves against baseless attacks, rather than being the power of the state and the power of life and death, often. So it's really complicated. And I think one of Royko's great strengths as a writer, not just in Boss, but in all of his collections of columns, is how willing he is to really drill down into the nuances without ignoring the hard facts. Like he constantly refers to Bridgeport as Mayor Daley's racist neighborhood. In 1930, there was one black resident in Bridgeport. Today, Bridgeport has 3% of its residents are black, even though now it's 60% Latino and Asian. There was just a story in Black Club Chicago the other day about the old diner at 35th and Halsted being reopened by a black family who, when they were kids, the women running it now, their family was pulled out of a car and assaulted by Bridgeport whites on that very corner, and the people who owned that restaurant then would not let them in to call the police. And now they've reopened the diner. So Royko can get into these nuances and these subtleties in ways that lots of writers don't. Part of that is simply the vast amount he got to write. 7,500 columns. If you check out the exhibit, which you'll have in about an hour to do after I'm done in a few minutes, you can see that stuff. All right, let me see if anybody else. No, people, this tech stuff just in. So here's one that's more of a comment. You mentioned the streets as a contested public space in '68. As we all know, Chicago streets are also segregated enclaves with overlapping territorial boundaries. Can I talk about the interactions between the police, the demonstrators, and groups like the Young Lords and the Blackstone Rangers? Omar Lopez, Young Lords information minister, reflected on his experience in the convention riots. Quote, "The police came all the way to Lincoln Park, and the only reason the Young Lords came out was because of that. And we did pick up rocks. We did pick up bottles. We did attack squad cars. For us, that was a natural thing to do." So the Young Lords and the Blackstone Rangers and a group that I'm blanking on the name of, and I apologize, but a white social justice group, all located in Uptown, all were allied. There was a huge social justice movement in Uptown that had white, Latino, and black groups working together. And the fact that all of these groups, these Appalachian whites, were also discriminated against by the police, right? They were hillbillies. They went into the hillbilly bars and busted them up. And they were discriminated against because of their accents and where they were from. They had a natural sort of commonality as outsiders. That's, I think, the real key. If you conceive of the world as hierarchies composed of insiders and outsiders, and you define some people as outsiders based on their group identity, I think it's completely natural to expect them to fight back. In fact, it'd be kind of crazy if they didn't. And that's the worldview that Daley had, and that I think was pervasive in much of the democratic machine he led. Not all of it. There was plenty of lakefront liberals and that kind of thing as well. But the world of Mike Royko and Richard J. Daley was this world of ethnic and racial identity being like the primary thing in life. It's really remarkable that Royko grew up, as he described himself, a flat above a tavern youth, right, in a Polish-American enclave out on Milwaukee Avenue, and wasn't racist. He was so far ahead with his writing. He was so much on the side of King and the civil rights demonstrators. Meanwhile, a guy who's just an Irish version of him, Daley, 10 years old, 15 years old or whatever, just buys into these hierarchies and these divisions. So Royko is someone you want to read to see the bright side of that ethnic Chicago culture that was so pervasive. All right, we're basically out of time. I just want to thank you all again. Thanks to the Newberry. Thanks to everybody who works at the Newberry.